already deep into his second-term trade wars, President Trump now doubling his punch on steel and aluminum tariffs.
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
The Trump administration is adding hundreds of items to the list of steel and aluminum products now subject to higher tariffs.
Picture this: steel, once the backbone of North American industry, the material that built bridges, skyscrapers, and automobiles, is now the front line of a modern trade war. Trump demands steep tariffs. Canada looks him in the eye and says no. And standing right in the middle, trembling under the weight of politics, tariffs, and rising costs, is the U.S. auto industry, already on the brink of collapse. This is not a side story. It's the main act. And both countries are playing hardball. Canada's role is front and center. Within days of Trump announcing his sweeping trade measures earlier this year, Ottawa made its stance crystal clear. It would not bow, it would not roll over, and it would not sacrifice Canadian workers to satisfy Washington's demands. That early refusal has now shaped everything, from how Detroit automakers plan production, to how supply chains stretch across borders, to how politicians on both sides calculate their next move. The conflict is not abstract, it's brutally real. Canadian factories are tied into American production lines like veins in a body. Steel moves from Hamilton to Michigan. Auto parts cross Ontario into Ohio. Aluminum from Quebec feeds U.S. aerospace. The moment tariffs hit, costs ripple across this network instantly. Already, Canadian steel producers say they're struggling. U.S. auto executives are warning of looming layoffs. And union leaders on both sides of the border are shouting the same refrain: stop this before it destroys us all. It began back on February 1st, 2025, when Trump fired the opening shot. He announced a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and slapped a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. His argument? National security. In his words, foreign steel was a threat to America's strength. But this wasn't just about imports from China or Russia. Canada, America's closest ally, was suddenly lumped into the same category. Ottawa's reaction was swift and fierce. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced retaliatory tariffs worth roughly 30 billion Canadian dollars, targeting U.S. products from food staples to household items. Within weeks, the trade relationship between the two largest partners in the Western Hemisphere turned into a battlefield. The escalation came quickly. By March, the U.S. had tightened tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and most critically, the auto sector. Canada responded by matching tariffs on U.S. goods, but it also tried to show some pragmatism. On April 15th, Carney's government suspended certain tariffs for 6 months on imports deemed vital to Canadian industries: medical equipment, food processing machinery, and yes, some auto components. It was a delicate balance: shield industries from Trump's assault while keeping critical supply chains alive. But the numbers don't lie. Canada's auto sector employs more than 600,000 people and generates the second largest share of the country's export earnings. It is tied hand in glove with the U.S. auto sector. When Stellantis temporarily shut down its Windsor assembly plant this summer, more than 3,600 workers were sent home. The ripple effects hit suppliers across Ontario and Michigan. And this was no isolated case. Multiple factories warned of temporary closures as tariffs drove up costs and squeezed margins.
GM says its second quarter profits fell by $1 billion. Stellantis says
Carney's government tried to soften the blow with a $2 billion Canadian strategic response fund, offering aid to industries hit hardest. But businesses quickly said the money was a drop in the bucket compared to the billions at stake. Workers feared not just temporary layoffs, but the permanent relocation of production lines. For border towns like Windsor and Detroit, this wasn't politics, it was survival. Fast forward to late August, after months of tit-for-tat measures, Carney announced Canada would lift many of its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods.
I'm announcing today that the Canadian government will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under CUSMA.
about 21 billion Canadian dollars worth of tariffs on items like orange juice, peanut butter, wine, and household staples were removed, offering some relief to consumers. But make no mistake, steel, aluminum, and autos stayed firmly on the list. Carney defended the move as a sign of good faith, a way to ease pressure without surrendering leverage. Trump, however, doubled down, insisting steel tariffs were non-negotiable under the umbrella of national security. The economic impacts were immediate. The Canadian dollar ticked up 0.5% against the U.S. greenback, signaling investor relief at reduced consumer costs. But industry leaders, especially in steel, were furious. They argued that Canada had given away too much leverage by lifting tariffs on consumer goods while keeping only partial shields on its industrial base. Union leaders warned of more job losses, and auto executives quietly lobbied both governments, warning that unless tariffs eased, North America's competitiveness would wither under the weight of rising costs. Here's the staggering reality. Nearly 90% of all vehicles made in North America already comply with the USMCA's strict 75% regional content rules. Yet tariffs on steel and aluminum essentially punish manufacturers even when they follow the rules. Automakers are now spending millions of dollars just to navigate new layers of compliance checks, exemptions, and counter-exemptions. The administrative burden alone has turned what should be efficient cross-border production into a bureaucratic nightmare. Why did this happen? At its core, Trump's tariffs are as much political as economic. His message to voters is simple: protect American jobs, shield American factories, and punish countries that he believes are taking advantage of U.S. trade. Canada, despite being a top ally and neighbor, has become a convenient target, easy to hit, easy to frame as a competitor, and useful as a bargaining chip in Trump's larger geopolitical game. For Carney, the challenge has been equally political. He must project strength to Canadians, showing he won't cave to Washington, while also keeping enough flexibility to prevent the collapse of Canada's export-driven economy. The stakes couldn't be higher. The auto industry in the U.S. is already fragile. Electric vehicle adoption is expensive, supply chains for batteries are stretched, and inflation is biting into consumer demand. Add steel and aluminum tariffs, and U.S. automakers face a brutal squeeze. Higher input costs mean either raising car prices, which drives customers away, or absorbing losses, which leads to layoffs. Analysts warn that if the dispute drags on into 2026, North America could see permanent shifts of production to Mexico or even overseas, hollowing out both Canadian and American industrial bases. Right now, the future is murky. Negotiations are ongoing, but progress is slow. Canada has hinted it may reimpose broader counter tariffs if Trump doesn't back down by July 21st. U.S. automakers, meanwhile, are intensifying their lobbying efforts in Washington, warning that entire supply chains are at risk. Investors are jittery, watching for signs that inflation could spike again if the dispute deepens. So where does this leave us? The auto corridor that stretches from Ontario through Michigan and into Ohio remains in jeopardy. Communities built on steel mills and assembly plants wake up every day wondering if their jobs will still exist next year. Politicians talk in the language of percentages and tariffs, but for families, this is about mortgages, schools, and futures. Canada said no, and for now, it holds the line. But the question is, how long can both economies absorb the pain before someone blinks? As we close, think about this. Trade isn't just about goods crossing borders. It's about people. The worker in Windsor, the welder in Pittsburgh, the mechanic in Detroit. They all stand in the shadow of decisions made in Ottawa and Washington. If tariffs stay, they pay the price. So what do you think? Will Canada's defiance force Trump to soften his stance, or will this trade war spiral until the auto industry, already fragile, finally snaps? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more, and stay tuned because this story is only heating up.